March 7, 1945. The heights overlooking Remagen, Germany. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Andermann lifted his binoculars. His hands shook, not with fear, but with a stunned disbelief. Through the thin, early afternoon haze, he saw something that overturned every tactical expectation of the previous 6. The bridge remained intact. One bridge, the only bridge. Every German commander from the Rhine to the Elbe had clear orders: demolish every crossing before the Allies could seize them. Yet the Ludendorff Bridge still stood, its purred stone towers thrusting skyward like monuments to German engineering, its steel arches spanning the 300 meters of the Rhine River, the final natural barrier keeping the West at bay. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann, beside Andermann, spoke the line that would be replayed in history: "We must seize it right now, before they blow it to hell." What none of them grasped then was that taking this single crossing would precipitate the most devastating strategy collapse in German military history, a psychological demolition of Nazi defensive doctrine so absolute that German officers would later call it the moment they knew. Beyond doubt, the war was lost. The arithmetic of that moment was written not in soldiers' blood but in the cold geometry of strategy. The Rhine was more than a river. It was a 300-mile fortress, with currents capable of capsizing assault boats, depths deep enough to swallow armored vehicles, and banks so steep they could bottle up advancing infantry. Since Roman legions first stared across its waters at the Germanic woods, the Rhine had been central Germany's defensive line against Western invasion. By March 1945, it was Hitler's last hope to buy time, to negotiate separate terms with Western allies, or to shift divisions from the collapsing Eastern Front for a final stand. A single unbroken bridge would break that calculation within minutes of fighting. The setting for catastrophe had been assembled months earlier. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last great Western offensive, had collapsed by late January 1945. What Nazi propaganda had called a decisive counterstroke had instead consumed Germany's last mobile reserves. Roughly 100,000 German casualties, some 600 tanks wrecked, and the irreplaceable loss of veteran panzer divisions left the forces west of the Rhine hollow shadows of their former selves. By early March, 12 American divisions pressed toward the river along a front that ran from the Netherlands to Switzerland. The German 15th Army, tasked with holding the vital stretch between Cologne and Koblenz, could barely field 50,000 combat-effective troops against an enemy 5 times larger. The bridge itself carried an irony both sides felt. Named for General Erich Ludendorff, Germany's brilliant but ultimately unsuccessful First World War strategist, the crossing had been built between 1916 and 1919, largely by Russian prisoners of war. Those prisoners, forced to labor under brutal conditions, had made a bridge to weld steel trusses sized for fully loaded military trains, stone towers at each end with 3 stories of defensive positions, 4 massive stone piers sunk into the Rhine's bedrock. Original plans had provided demolition chambers within the structure, cavities intended to hold explosives so the bridge could be wrecked before enemy hands took it. After World War I, French occupation forces had poured those cavities full of concrete. When Hitler reoccupied the Rhineland in 1936, German engineers fastened 60 zinc-lined boxes to the bridge's girders, each meant for 3 kilograms of explosives. The system was designed to detonate together, collapsing the entire span into the Rhine in seconds. But fate and Hitler's paranoia intervened in October 1944. An American bomb hit the Mulheim Bridge at Cologne, triggering its prepositioned charges and demolishing the crossing sooner than the Germans intended. Hitler's fury was volcanic. He ordered the immediate court-martial of officers deemed responsible and commanded that demolition charges on Rhine bridges be removed and stored nearby. New directives said charges couldn't be reinstalled when Allied forces came within 8 kilometers, and that bridges were to be destroyed only by written permission from sector commanders. The policy created a nightmare for German officers: detonate a bridge too early and face court-martial for destroying a vital retreat route, delay too long and risk execution for letting key infrastructure fall to the enemy. That psychological squeeze froze German decision-making when decisive choices were most needed. The American push toward Remagen was codenamed Operation Lumberjack, an unassuming title for what would turn into one of the war's most consequential maneuvers. Its main aims were seizing Cologne and Koblenz, 2 ancient cities that controlled vital Rhine crossings. The American First Army, led by Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, drove east across the Eifel region, meeting resistance that had degenerated from organized defense into frantic delaying actions. German commanders had no illusions about halting the American drive. Their orders were simple: slow them down, buy time for units to withdraw across the Rhine before the bridges were blown. Major General John Leonard's 90th Armored Division, the Phantom Division, because German intelligence kept reporting it destroyed only to find it again days later, spearheaded the American thrust. The morning of March 7th dawned with fog blanketing the Rhine Valley. German command confusion had reached a level unimaginable in the Wehrmacht of 1940. General Edwin von Roth, commander of the 53rd Corps responsible 4th Remagen sector, had accidentally wandered into American lines on March 6 and been captured. His replacement, General Richard von Othmar, could not reach Rhine because American units had already cut the roads. At Timmermann on March 7th, General Otto Hitzfeld of the 67th Corps was told that he now was responsible for defending the Ludendorff Bridge, despite being 64 kilometers away and having never even seen the structure. Hitzfeld immediately sent his adjutant, Major Hans Scheller, to take charge of the bridge defense. Scheller left in the morning with 8 men and a radio, planning to commandeer retreating units to establish a defensive perimeter. The journey became a nightmare of wrong turns, American roadblocks, and fuel shortages. The radio team got separated. Scheller did not reach Remagen until less than 2 hours before American forces crested the heights above the town. Captain Willy Bratke, the German commandant, actually present at Remagen, led a force that existed more on paper than in reality. Officially, he had 600 men. In truth, his combat strength amounted to 36 soldiers, most wounded, elderly, or children from the Volksmilitia. Many were Astropan, Soviet POWs, who had volunteered to serve in German uniform to escape prison camps. Their dependability in battle against Americans was, at best, uncertain. Bratke had spent weeks begging for reinforcements, for reliable radio gear, for anything that might help him hold a strategic point. Everyone seemed to have forgotten until the Americans appeared on the horizon. His pleas vanished into the chaos of a collapsing command chain. The demolition charges that should have been permanently fixed to the bridge were still stored in a nearby building, waiting for orders to reinstall them. When those orders finally arrived on March 6th, engineer officers scrambled to place 2,800 kilograms of explosives in the piers. Anto attached 300 shaped charges to critical structural nodes. The American advance on March 7th carried an air of fate, an outcome no one had planned, yet one that would change the course of the war. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Enderman led a task force from the 9th Armored Division's Combat Command, B, composed of units from the 14th Tank Battalion and the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion. Their mission was simple on paper: seize the town of Remagen, then pivot south to link up with the Third Army. None of them anticipated finding a bridge, still standing. U.S. intelligence had confirmed that German engineers were methodically demolishing every crossing over the Rhine as Allied forces drew near. Photographs showed the ruins of bridges at Cologne, Bonn, and Koblenz. By every calculation, the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen should already have been reduced to twisted metal and stone. When Enderman's leading units emerged from the forest overlooking the town at roughly 2 o'clock p.m., the sight before them was surreal, like an illusion. German vehicles were still rolling across the span. Civilians crowded the approaches. The bridge stood whole, its black shapes of demolition charges clearly visible along the steel girders. The man chosen to lead the assault, Lieutenant Karl Timmermann, was only 22. Born in Frankfurt, Germany, in 1922, he had immigrated to the United States as a baby. Fluent in German, he instantly understood what they were witnessing. The bridge wasn't just a crossing, it was the last barrier undone. The final natural defense overcome not by brute force but by timing, confusion and chance. Brigadier General William Hoge, commander of Combat Command B, arrived on the heights around 2:45 p.m. and grasped the magnitude at once. This wasn't merely a tactical opportunity, it was a strategic windfall. A successful crossing here could leapfrog 3 weeks ahead of Montgomery's meticulously prepared Operation Plunder, which wasn't scheduled to begin until late March. Hoge made the decision that would define his legacy: we're taking that bridge now. The German defenders, meanwhile, faced disaster. Major Hans Scheller had reached the bridge just over 2 hours earlier after his grueling journey and was shocked by what he saw. Captain Bratka briefed him quickly. The bridge was rigged for demolition with electrical detonators, controlled from the eastern tunnel entrance. A secondary fuse system could be lit by hand if needed. The defensive perimeter, however, was practically non-existent. Most of the soldiers Scheller had planned to assemble were already retreating across the river or had bypassed Remagen entirely. The fog that had hidden the valley through the morning had lifted at exactly the worst time, giving American artillery spotters a perfect view. Around 3 p.m. U.S. tanks appeared on the western edge of town. The moment for hesitation was gone. The assault on Remagen itself took less than half an hour. Lieutenant John Grimble's platoon of M26 Pershing tanks led the way, the newest and most formidable armor in the American arsenal. So new, in fact, that most German troops had never even seen one, with 90mm guns that could pierce any German tank. They were a moving symbol of American industrial might. The Pershings fired white phosphorus shells to lay down smoke and blasted German positions with high explosives. Timmermann's infantry followed close behind, moving through shattered streets, scarred by years of Allied bombing. Once a scenic Rhine resort, Remagen now lay half in ruins. A few German troops still resisting quickly fell back. Most simply ran across the bridge, watching from near the western tower. Captain Bratka knew the time had come. At 3:20 p.m., he gave the command to detonate the western approach ramp. The blast tore a crater 3 meters wide, halting American tanks, but the main structure still stood. Now it was a race of minutes, meters, and courage. American tanks set up at the western end, pounding German positions on the opposite shore. The Erpler lay, a basalt cliff rising 180 meters on the eastern bank, bristled with German anti-aircraft guns, now turned downward to fire directly on the Americans. Timmermann's infantry, roughly 120 men from a company, 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, began their dash across the bridge at about 3:50 p.m. They advanced in bursts, darting between the bridge's stone towers and railings for cover. German machine guns rattled from the eastern towers and the tunnel mouth beyond, bullets whining off steel and stone. Several Americans went down within seconds. The rest kept moving. From the tunnel entrance, Major Scheller faced the most consequential decision of his life. The bridge was wired with explosives. The electrical detonator was ready. American troops were already halfway across. Every rule of warfare demanded he destroy it immediately. But Lieutenant Karl Peters, commander of a nearby anti-aircraft battery, rushed to him with an urgent plea. His unit manned the top-secret Henschel HS-297 rocket launcher system, a weapon that fired 24 high-velocity anti-aircraft rockets with deadly precision. That battery was still positioned on the western side. If Scheller detonated now, he'd obliterate the equipment and hand the Americans an intelligence prize. Reluctantly, Scheller agreed to wait. It was a decision that would seal his fate. Captain Karl Friesenhand, the engineer officer in charge of the explosives, waited by the detonator inside the tunnel. When Peters's battery finally made it across, Scheller gave the order. Around 4 p.m., with Americans 2/3 of the way over, Friesenhand turned the key. Nothing happened. The circuit had failed. A shell fragment likely severed the wires earlier, though no one ever confirmed it. Moments later, Sergeant Alex Drabik, a 34-year-old from Toledo, Ohio, sprinted across and became the first American soldier to set foot on the eastern bank of the Rhine since Napoleon's armies had crossed the other way over a century before. Behind him, Timmermann and the rest of a company surged forward. Engineer Sergeant Eugene Dorland and his team immediately began cutting every visible wire, racing to disable the remaining charges before the Germans could ignite the backup system. On the German side, Corporal Anton Faust, an engineer, volunteered for a suicidal task. He dashed from the tunnel, ran nearly 100 meters under direct fire, and lit the backup fuse by hand. At roughly 4:10 p.m., the secondary explosion rocked the entire span. The bridge heaved several inches off its supports and then slammed back into place. Smoke and debris engulfed the scene. American soldiers were thrown to the deck, ears ringing. When the haze lifted, the bridge was still standing. The steel arches were battered but intact. The roadbed sagged 6 inches but remained passable. The bridge held. The race was finished. The Americans had won. What followed was chaos tempered by training and sheer determination. U.S. combat engineers poured onto the bridge, stripping away remaining explosives and patching the damaged approach ramp. Lieutenant Colonel Harvey Fraser's 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, established a defensive line on the eastern shore. Pushing outward from the tunnel toward the slopes of the Erpel. German resistance collapsed in minutes. Captain Bratke and what was left of his command retreated into the 400-meter-long railroad tunnel beneath the cliff, seeking cover from the unstoppable tide now pouring across the Rhine. By nightfall, Lieutenant Timmermann and his troops had secured control of the tunnel entrance, rounding up several hundred exhausted German soldiers, many of whom seemed almost grateful that their war had finally come to an end. Major Scheller, realizing the full weight of his responsibility, made a desperate and fatal decision. Aware that the bridge was lost, and that he was officially accountable for its defense, he seized a bicycle and pedaled eastward, determined to find his corps' headquarters and explain the disaster in person. For days later, he was apprehended, placed under arrest, and executed by firing squad after a hasty court-martial as the scapegoat for a defeat that had many architects. News of the bridge's capture surged through the American command network like an electric shock. Around dusk, Brigadier General Hodge radioed his superior, Major General John Leonard, with a message that sounded both impossible and triumphant. "We got the bridge." Leonard wasted no time forwarding the news to First Army headquarters. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges was in the midst of a staff briefing when the call came through. According to witnesses, Hodges lunged for the telephone with such excitement that he knocked his coffee cup to the floor. Within moments, he was speaking directly to the 12th Army Group Commander, General Omar Bradley. Bradley was deep in a meeting with his operations officer, Major General Harold Bull, when an aide rushed in with the urgent message. "Brad, we've got a bridge," Hodges exclaimed, his voice trembling with disbelief and exhilaration. "A bridge? You mean you've actually got one, intact across the Rhine?" Bradley asked, springing from his chair. "Yep," Hodges replied. "Leonard's men grabbed it at Remagen before the Germans could blow it." Bradley's response would soon become legend among the American High Command. "Hot dog, Courtney, this will bust the whole front wide open. Are you getting your stuff across?" "As fast as we can push it over," Hodges assured him. Bradley immediately phoned Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower at headquarters in Reims, France. Eisenhower understood the magnitude of the event at once. He later described it as one of those rare, fleeting opportunities in war that, if seized quickly, can alter the entire course of a campaign. Eisenhower's original strategy had been to let Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group conduct the main Rhine crossing near Wessel later that month. Supported by massive artillery barrages and airborne landings, the American crossings were to be secondary, smaller, and carefully synchronized. But the unexpected seizure of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen changed everything. Eisenhower ordered Bradley to exploit the bridgehead immediately. Every available division, tank, and support unit was to be diverted there. Within mere hours, the strategic center of gravity along the entire Western Front shifted south toward Remagen. The German reaction was a grim display of chaos, fury, and blame. When the news reached Adolf Hitler at his Berlin headquarters, it triggered both despair and murderous rage. For months, Hitler had convinced himself that the Rhine would buy him time to rebuild shattered armies, or even to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies. The loss of an intact bridgehead demolished those fantasies. His first impulse was vengeance. Hitler summoned Generalleutnant Rudolf Hübner, a fanatical loyalist infamous for his brutality on the Eastern Front. Hübner was placed in charge of a roving flying court-martial, empowered to identify, condemn, and execute anyone deemed responsible for the loss. The so-called court was nothing more than a traveling execution squad dressed up as legal authority, accompanied by 2 lieutenant colonels and 2 military policemen who doubled as the firing squad. Hübner made it clear that he required no legal reference. When offered a copy of the German Military Justice Code, he reportedly sneered that the only law he recognized was the Führer's will. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of all German forces in the West, was dismissed on March 10 as part of this wave of scapegoating. Hitler's paranoia demanded a senior head to roll. Rundstedt's post was handed to Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, hastily recalled from Italy. Kesselring, a seasoned strategist nicknamed Hitler's fireman for his skill at stabilizing collapsing fronts, quickly realized the truth. Remagen had shattered any hope of holding the Rhine. Would later describe the event as the crime of Remagen, admitting that it destroyed the Western Front's defensive coherence and made continued resistance hopeless. Even Hermann Göring, commander of the collapsing Luftwaffe, was blunt in his assessment. The bridge's capture, he declared, made prolonged defense impossible. The psychological blow was immense. German officers who still clung to faint hopes of holding the Rhine now saw the end approaching fast. Hubner's Flin court-martial began its bloody work almost immediately. On March 9th, General Major Richard von Bothmer, who nominally commanded the Bonn and Remagen sectors, though he never reached the bridge, was tried for dereliction of duty. He was stripped of rank, sentenced to 5 years in prison, and humiliated before his peers. Broken by despair, his wife dead, his son already killed in the war, von Bothmer seized a pistol from a guard and shot himself in the courtroom the following day. 2 days later, on March 11th, Hubner's tribunal arrived at Field Marshal Model's Army Group B headquarters. 4 more officers were condemned in trials that each lasted less than an hour. Major Hans Skeller was convicted of failing to destroy the bridge, despite arriving only 2 hours before the attack, and doing everything humanly possible under impossible conditions. Lieutenant Karl Peters was sentenced for allowing his rocket launcher unit to fall into American hands, though he had pleaded for time to move his equipment. Majors August Kraft and Herbert Strobel, combat engineers, who had laid the initial demolition charges days earlier but were 60 kilometers away during the assault, were accused of negligence in preparing the explosives. All 4 were executed on March 14, 1945. In the woods near Rimbach and Ober, the men were led into the forest, forced to kneel, and shot in the back of the neck. Their bodies were dumped into shallow, unmarked graves. Captain Willy Bratich, the actual commander who had overseen the bridge's defense and done more than anyone to arrange its demolition, was sentenced to death in absentia. But by then Bratich was already in American captivity. Taken prisoner inside the railway tunnel on March 7th, Captain Karl Friesen, the engineer who had physically tried to detonate the charges, was also captured by U.S. forces, tried in absentia as well. Friesenhan was acquitted, the lone moment of fairness in an otherwise farcical process. Field Marshal Model personally endorsed all of Hubner's executions and ordered that their details be broadcast to every German unit as a warning. Failure, regardless of reason, meant death. While German officers were dying for losing the bridge, American soldiers were streaming across it in a flood that grew by the hour. The bridge, though scarred and unstable, remained standing. Army engineers labored day and night to reinforce weakened supports and patch the approach roads. Floodlights were rigged to keep the crossing open after dark, while military police directed the endless convoys of men and vehicles. Within 24 hours of the bridge's capture, more than 8,000 U.S. troops had crossed to the eastern bank. Infantry, tanks, artillery, and support units pouring over the only intact Rhine bridge left between Switzerland and the North Sea. The Americans understood from the beginning that the captured bridge might give way at any moment. Combat engineers were ordered to start building alternate crossings immediately. By March 9th, just 48 hours after the seizure, the first tactical bridge was already in place, an M1940 aluminum alloy treadway bridge, constructed just north of the Ludendorff span. Work began at once on a second pontoon bridge. Their objective was clear: make the bridgehead permanent, no matter what happened to the original structure. Hitler's reaction was to plow every remaining resource at the Rhine crossing. By March 1945, this meant little more than hastily assembled battle groups, cobbled together from shattered units, rear area personnel, and scattered reserves. The Luftwaffe, now a faint echo of its former might, launched wave after wave of desperate air assaults. During the next 10 days, American observers counted 367 separate German sorties directed at the Remagen sector. In response, the U.S. Army massed the largest concentration of anti-aircraft firepower in the European theater. 5 battalions, hundreds of guns formed a deadly protective ring around the bridge. The skies above Remagen turned into one of the fiercest anti-aircraft duels of the entire war. American gunners claimed over 100 enemy planes destroyed in that brief, furious span. Germany's latest weapons joined the fray. Arado AR-234 jet bombers, the world's first operational jets of their kind, streaked in at speeds over 800 kilometers an hour, diving toward the target. They were nearly untouchable, but their bombing precision at such velocity was miserable. Most of their payloads splashed harmlessly into the Rhine. Soon afterward came the Messerschmitt Me-262, the first operational jet fighter faster than anything the Allies could field. Yet even cutting-edge technology could not alter the truth. Too few aircraft, too little fuel, too few trained pilots. The Luftwaffe's raids inflicted damage and casualties, but failed to destroy the original bridge or the new crossings rising beside it. In his fury, Hitler personally authorized the use of V-2 rockets against the bridge, the first and only instance in which these long-range missiles were aimed at a tactical target, designed to terrorize London, not to hit pinpoint objectives. The V-2 traveled at over 5,000 km per hour, far too fast for accuracy. 11 rockets were fired from launch sites in the Netherlands, 130 kilometers away. They killed a handful of American soldiers and an unknown number of German civilians, but none struck the bridge itself. Next came underwater attacks. German naval divers, 7 demolition experts equipped with Italian-made breathing gear slipped into the Rhine under cover of darkness, but American canal defense lights, powerful beams that sliced across the water's surface, revealed them. All 7 were killed or captured before they could reach their target. The Germans tried everything: explosive-filled boats, drifting mines disguised as logs, even the mighty Karl siege mortar, a 600mm giant that hurled shells weighing more than 2 tons. Each shell could pulverize a fortress, but the mortar's aim was unreliable, and positioning it took days. The few rounds that did reach Remagen landed wide of the mark. Instead of demoralizing the enemy, these frantic German efforts had the opposite effect. Every failed strike boosted American morale while showcasing the Reich's desperation. Soldiers on both sides recognized what they were witnessing: the death throes of the captured German troops often expressed relief that their ordeal was finished. Many admitted they had been awaiting suicidal orders to counterattack the bridge. Now those orders never came. Strategically, the implications were stark. With US forces firmly established on the Rhine's east bank, the river had lost its value as a defensive barrier. Every German formation pinned against the Remagen bridgehead was one less available to repel the massive Allied crossings still to come later in March. The Western Front was unraveling beyond repair. Major General Karl Wagener, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Walter Model, later summed up the disaster with grim precision. In post-war interrogation, he stated, "The capture of the bridge marked the end of the war for Germany." The Remagen affair created a deep sense of guilt and shame within the German command. It proved that the Allies held complete initiative and that German forces could only react, never regain the advantage. The failure to destroy the bridge exposed the total collapse of German command and control. For officers raised in the rigid Prussian military tradition, it was more than a tactical setback. It was a moral breakdown, undeniable proof that the once formidable Wehrmacht of 1940 had disintegrated beyond recognition. On March 17th, shortly after midday, the Ludendorff Bridge finally gave way. The structure had endured 10 days under impossible strain, days of non-stop traffic, bombardment, and vibrations from near-miss explosions. The metal, already weakened by decades of service and by the failed demolition attempt on March 7th, began to give. Witnesses heard rivets snapping like gunfire. A vertical support on the southern arch buckled, then another. The center span lurched upward briefly before plunging into the Rhine with a thunderous crash that echoed 4 kilometers. 28 American engineers were killed and more than 60 injured, most of them from the 276th Engineer Combat Battalion, working on reinforcement and repair when the bridge collapsed. The irony was cruel. The very men who had saved the bridge through their tireless efforts to disable German explosives perished when it finally succumbed to its own damage. Yet by then, its fall no longer mattered. Strategically, the bridge had already served its purpose. American combat engineers had already finished constructing 2 tactical bridges and were closing in on a third. Pontoon spans, treadway crossings, and Bailey bridges now stretched across the Rhine at several points near Rhine. Before the battered Ludendorff Bridge finally gave way, more than 25,000 American troops had already made it across. Its collapse didn't slow the tide, it accelerated it. The new tactical bridges could carry heavier traffic, allowing even more men and machines to surge eastward. By March 25th, just 18 days after the bridge's stunning capture, over 125,000 American soldiers had crossed the Rhine at Remagen. 6 entire divisions, complete with tanks, artillery, and supply convoys, had carved out a stronghold on the eastern bank. The bridgehead stretched 8 miles deep and 25 miles wide, encompassing 11 kilometers of a vital stretch of autobahn linking the Ruhr industrial heartland with Frankfurt. From there, the Allies had a direct path into the center of Germany itself. The breakout from the Remagen bridgehead began that same day, March 25th. Once confined by the narrow perimeter, American armored units now burst forward like a flood released. Combat Command B of the 9th Armored Division advanced 108 kilometers in a single day. Combat Commander covered 110 kilometers in just 11 hours. Where German resistance had been fierce and unyielding around the bridge, it now seemed to dissolve across the wider front. Whole formations surrendered en masse, unwilling to be annihilated. On March 29th alone, Combat Command captured over 1,200 prisoners in one engagement. The American advance was so swift and overwhelming that German commanders could no longer track their own forces. Field Marshal Walther Model's Army Group B once, numbering some 325,000 men, before the Remagen breakthrough began to collapse. Divisions lost contact with Corps headquarters. Corps lost contact with Army Command. The rigid structure that had held the Wehrmacht together through 5 years of brutal war was unraveling at last. The consequences rippled through every level of the German defense. Field Marshal Model suddenly found himself trying to command an army group that was simultaneously fighting to contain the Remagen bridgehead, to stop American forces breaking through from other Rhine crossings, and to prevent the encirclement of the Ruhr industrial region. Achieving all three was beyond impossible with the men and materiel remaining. The Ruhr, Germany's beating industrial heart, responsible for roughly 80% of its coal and steel production, was now on the brink of isolation. Bodl understood what that meant. Losing the Ruhr meant losing the war's lifeblood. Without coal and steel, Germany could no longer replace its losses, power its vehicles, or manufacture ammunition. The fall of the Ludendorff Bridge had set in motion the fall of the Ruhr, and the fall of the Ruhr would mean the collapse of the Third Reich itself. By March 31st, barely 3 weeks after Remagen's capture, all 4 American armies on the Western Front had crossed the Rhine, the crossing that Allied planners had expected to require a massive amphibious effort. Thousands of casualties and weeks of fierce combat was instead achieved with astonishing speed. The Rhine, which had held back Roman legions and served as Germany's western fortress for nearly 2,000 years, had been breached in multiple places in less than a month. General Dwight D. Eisenhower captured the scale of the triumph in his memoirs. "We were across the Rhine on a permanent bridge. The traditional defensive barrier to the heart of Germany was pierced. The final defeat of the enemy, which we had long calculated would require the campaigning of spring and summer 1945, was suddenly, in our minds, just around the corner." Eisenhower's words echoed across the Allied world. War correspondents declared that the campaign had been shortened by months. Even British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, whose carefully orchestrated Operation Plunder had been overshadowed by the audacious success at Remagen, acknowledged its strategic magnitude. Soviet commanders, watching the rapid Western advance, accelerated their own offensive from the east to ensure they reached Berlin first. The race for Germany had become a sprint, and the starting gun had been fired at Remagen. Within Germany, assessments varied on how much the loss of the bridge had shortened the war. Some argued weeks, others months. In truth, exact numbers were meaningless. The bridge's capture hadn't simply pushed the Allied timeline forward, it had upended the entire strategic balance. Before Remagen, German leaders could still imagine holding the Rhine through April or even May, using the time to fortify Berlin's defenses and perhaps negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies. After Remagen, those hopes evaporated. The Rhine had fallen 3 weeks ahead of schedule, and the reserves meant for Montgomery's crossing in the north had been squandered in desperate, futile efforts to destroy the Remagen bridgehead. The psychological blow was even greater than the military one. German soldiers who had long believed the Rhine to be an unbreachable wall now saw American tanks rolling across it with ease. Morale plummeted. Colonel F. Russell Lyons, the 3rd Corps engineer whose men had seized and held the bridge, estimated that having an intact crossing saved the Allies 2 months of fighting and as many as 35,000 casualties. His calculation came from comparing Remagen's crossing to the amphibious assaults required elsewhere along the river at Wesel, where Montgomery's Operation Plunder took place. The British and Americans had assembled more than 2,000 artillery pieces, conducted massive airborne drops, and still sustained heavy losses despite overwhelming superiority. At Remagen, the Americans crossed with minimal casualties because the bridge spared them the deadliest part of any river assault. The exposed journey and assault boats historian Ken Etchler, who conducted extensive post-war interviews with veterans from both sides, concluded that capturing the Ludendorff Bridge materially hastened the war's end. Other historians estimated that it shortened the conflict by as much as 6 months. While opinions differed in exact measure, the consensus was clear. Remagen had been a decisive turning point. The human cost of that triumph, however, remains a sobering testament to its significance. American casualties in the Battle of Remagen and the fighting that followed totaled around 860 killed, with nearly 5,700 wounded and a similar number missing. Those losses, though heavy, were concentrated in the brutal first 18 days from March 7th to March 25th. German losses during that same period were far greater, more than 11,700 captured, with killed and wounded likely exceeding 10,000. Exact figures were never fully recorded, but the disparity tells its own story. The Americans held every advantage: air power, artillery, armor, and above all, momentum. The Germans were ordered to counterattack with forces that no longer existed, equipment that constantly broke down, and a grim awareness that the war was already lost. The executions that followed only deepened the tragedy. 4 German officers were condemned for the loss of the bridge, a loss that had been inevitable long before their arrival. Major Hans Skeller, just 31, was a career officer who had served with distinction on both Eastern and Western fronts. He was married, with children he would never see grow up. His only crime was arriving at the bridge 2 hours before it was taken too late to change the outcome, with 36 exhausted men facing thousands of Americans supported by tanks and artillery. Lieutenant Karl Peters, a technical officer, was executed for attempting to safeguard secret equipment from capture, even though he had acted under existing orders to preserve advanced technology. Majors Kraft and Strobel, both engineers, were shot for following standard demolition procedures that had simply failed under impossible circumstances. None of the 4 had truly been guilty. They had become scapegoats for a nation collapsing under its own defeat. All 4 men had become scapegoats for a military system that had already rotted from the top down. After the war, General Lieutenant Rudolf Hübner, the man who presided over the so-called flying court-martial, faced trial in German courts and received a 4-year prison sentence for his part in those unlawful executions. It was a light punishment for what amounted to judicial murder, yet it at least acknowledged that, even amid Germany's collapse, a few recognized the proceedings for what they were: a sham. To fully understand Remagen's importance, one must also consider its influence on Allied strategic discussions about how to conclude the war. Before the bridge's capture, serious debate had taken place over whether to stop at the Rhine and let Soviet forces absorb the brunt of the final push into Germany. Some British and American planners argued that forcing a crossing would be costly, while the Red Army could accomplish the same objective with fewer Western casualties. Remagen erased that argument entirely. With US troops already over the Rhine and expanding their foothold, any thought of halting made no sense. The drive had to continue. The rapid thrust from the Rhine to the Elbe River, completed in just over a month, proved that choice correct. On April 25th, American and Soviet forces met at Torgau, slicing Germany in half. By May 8th, the nation had surrendered unconditionally. The bridge's capture resonated far beyond the battlefield. In the United States, news of its fall reached the Senate while it was in session. Senators broke protocol, suspending the ban on applause, and rose to cheer. Newspapers across the country blared headlines announcing that the end of the war in Europe was finally within sight. War bond sales spiked overnight. After years of brutal fighting and staggering casualties, Americans could feel victory close enough to touch. In Germany, the psychological effect was the exact opposite. Word of the bridge's loss raced through the army and civilian population, spreading despair. Nazi propaganda had long insisted the Rhine was unbreakable, that Allied forces would be smashed against its defenses. Learning that the river had been crossed almost effortlessly, that one bridge had survived through a mix of American luck and German mismanagement, shattered what little confidence the public still held in the regime's competence. The physical remnants of the Ludendorff Bridge tell their own quiet story. After the war, it was never rebuilt. The twisted steel and fractured stone were cleared from the Rhine, but the towers on either bank remained. The western towers were eventually transformed into a peace memorial, the Friedensmuseum Bruck von Remagen. Inside, exhibits trace the bridge's history from construction to destruction, with a special focus on the Battle of March 1945 and its consequences. On the eastern shore, the remaining towers now serve as a performing arts venue, a deliberate contrast, symbolizing how creation can rise from ruin. The soldiers who seized the bridge received honors worthy of their actions. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann earned the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor. Sergeant Alex Drabik received the same decoration. Dozens of men from the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion and the 14th Tank Battalion were awarded silver and bronze stars. Brigadier General William Hoge was promoted and given command of a corps, while the entire 9th Armored Division was presented with a Presidential Unit Citation for its heroism at Remagen. These medals acknowledged extraordinary courage, but could never fully capture the magnitude of what those men achieved. The soldiers who dashed across that bridge under fire did more than seize a strategic prize. They altered the course of the war. Every single day the conflict was shortened, meant thousands of military and civilian lives spared. Their actions directly contributed to that salvation. The story of Remagen also invites reflection on the role of chance in history. What if the fog had not lifted when it did? Would American scouts have spotted the bridge before it was blown? If the electrical detonators had worked properly, would the structure have vanished beneath their feet? Had Major Scheller arrived 2 hours earlier, could he have organized a defense strong enough to hold the Americans back? And if Hitler had not ordered explosives removed after the Cologne incident, would the Remagen charges have been correctly placed and effective? Each of these questions points toward a different possible outcome, a version of history in which the bridge was destroyed and the crossing of the Rhine proceeded according to the Allies' original timetable. The chain of coincidences, decisions, and errors that led to the bridge's capture demonstrates that history is not a fixed or deterministic process. Individual actions and random moments can combine to create results far beyond what anyone at the time could have predicted or controlled. In the end, any final assessment of Remagen must return to the human dimension of the story. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge was achieved by men acting under extraordinary pressure, uncertainty, and danger. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann led his company across a structure that could have exploded at any instant. Sergeant Alexander Drabik sprinted across the final span toward the eastern bank as German machine guns opened fire. Combat engineers worked courageously under enemy fire to remove or disable demolition charges. Tank crews on the western shore provided covering fire, while staff officers quickly recognized the opportunity and decided to act. Commanders at higher levels responded decisively, redirecting entire divisions and corps to exploit the breakthrough. Every person in this chain of action made a choice that contributed to the final outcome. Remove even one link, and the story might have unfolded very differently. This recognition of individual agency within the vast machinery of war is what makes the capture of Remagen so compelling. The men who fought there were not simply pawns in a predetermined drama, but active participants whose courage, discipline, and quick judgment shaped events in ways that changed the course of history. The 80th anniversary of the bridge's capture, observed in March 2025, was commemorated with ceremonies in both Remagen and the United States. Veterans organizations, historical societies, and military units tracing their lineage to the 9th Armored Division took part in tributes honoring the soldiers who fought there. The German government also acknowledged the battle's importance, emphasizing not only the military aspect, but also the enduring lessons about the human cost of war and the precious value of peace. These commemorations reflected the complex and layered legacy of the event. For Americans, Remagen represented a moment of triumph, a validation of courage, initiative, and decisive leadership. For Germans, it served as a reminder of defeat, but also of liberation from tyranny and the beginning of a new chapter in their national story. For historians, it remains a fascinating study in how contingency and determination interact in the unpredictable landscape of warfare. For everyone who reflects upon it, the story of Remagen stands as a powerful reminder that individual decisions, made in moments of crisis, can alter the course of history. The soldiers who captured the Ludendorff Bridge could not have known that their actions would become the subject of books, films, and countless studies. They were soldiers doing their duty amid circumstances none of them would have chosen. Yet their courage and persistence produced results of world-changing importance. That their duty led to such lasting consequences is a testament to both the unpredictability of war and the enduring strength of human courage.